Yeah, so you're probably aware, like with politics in America, there's this little pendulum that's been going on for the past 100 years. Democrats, Republicans, McCarthyism, something progressive, back and forth, right? Maybe everyone's not quite as well aware, that affects Native people and reservations. So starting with the treaty period in the 1800s, they appointed a white Indian agent to every reservation to run the show. So the existing tribal leaders were ignored, pushed to the side. The white Indian agent ran the show. They had their own police force called Indian Police. Sometimes they hired natives, sometimes they didn't. They had their own court system called Courts of Indian Offenses, and they actively suppressed Native culture. There were people who did a year's hard labor for participating in a dance or a giveaway in this area. They would be arrested by the Indian police and go to the Courts of Indian Offenses for doing those sorts of things. So it was pretty hands-on and difficult for Native leadership to manage. You got to imagine, like, in this area, 1855 is a treaty. So you've got people, if somebody's born in like the 1820s, they're 20 years old, they remember those treaties, they were there. And then in their own lifetime, and then there's a white guy trying to run the reservation and their Native leadership is being ignored. And then still within their own lifetime, you get up all the way up to the Indian Reorganization Act, and they're an elder, and they recall all the white Indian agents back to Washington, D.C. And they say, it's the age of self-determination, you can run your own show. And so at that time, I'm sure there's some people thinking, finally, get those guys off our back, hooray! But at the same time, if you look at places, you know, even like Leech Lake, each village had their own chiefs, but they had, you know, by that point in time, a lot of people had been moving all over the reservation. It was hard to determine who would be chief of them all. White Earth, they had relocated people from 20 different communities. No one's going to be chief of them all. It was hard to just, you know, we quit hitting you in the head with the hammer. Now you're well, be thankful. You know, there's still all this stuff to navigate. Also, I mean, there's more. I don't know how, you don't want the whole professor lecture on the Indian Reorganization Act, but at that time, most of the tribes in this area reorganized under the act and had basically what you would consider a corporate governance model, which was drafted by the US government and given to them. It's why you get the terminology RBC, Reservation Business Committee, and why the chief executive isn't called a president or a prime minister or something like that. They're called a chairman, like chairman of the board. You know, you also don't have a clear separation of powers, executive, judicial, legislative bodies and things like that. It's a corporate governance model, which is full of problems, some of which have been addressed, some of which still need to be addressed. It created an opening for tribes to start doing stuff. And eventually they did start doing stuff. But the pendulum, at the same time, you got to remember the 1930s, we're dealing with the New Deal legislation, a super progressive era, Tennessee Valley Authority, Civilian Conservation Corps, Social Security are developed, all these sorts of things. And that's when they're doing the Indian Reorganization Act. The pendulum swings the other way after World War II. You get McCarthyism, you get a much more conservative pushback on that stuff. And they said, what are we doing? So they passed new legislation, termination, that they would terminate tribes. There were 109 tribes terminated in the United States. They no longer exist. Citizens are only American citizens now. They implemented relocation. Here's a one-way bus ticket to go to Minneapolis, Chicago, Denver, Oakland, and help with your first month's rent. Get out of here. You can go make a better life in a big city. Today, 50% of tribal citizens live off reservation. 70% of self-identified natives live off reservation. You know, so the pendulum pushed back the other way. It's really only been, you know, there was another progressive surge in the 1970s. You get a big change with the advent of casino gaming in the 1990s, early 1990s, a lot more financial muscle for tribes. But tribes are constantly trying to affirm, build up their political sovereignty, the economic well-being of their communities, language, culture, things like that.